She thought she could control me. She thought her HOA ruled over everything in sight. But the moment she dragged me to court, the judge didn't just laugh at her case, he erased her entire HOA in one sentence. And I got to watch her perfect little kingdom crumble. When I first moved into my new home, I thought I'd finally found peace. After years of living in a noisy apartment building in the city, I wanted nothing more than space, privacy, and the kind of quiet you can only find in a neighborhood where the loudest sound is the occasional barking of a dog. My little house sat on a wide plot of land at the end of a tree-lined street. The driveway curved gently from the road to my garage, and the front porch was big enough for a rocking chair and a small table where I could drink my morning coffee. The best part, though, was that when I bought it, the real estate agent had reassured me there was no homeowners association, no petty rules about paint colors, no one measuring the height of my grass, no one telling me what I could park in my own driveway. I moved in late spring, just as the air was warm enough to keep the windows open. I spent those first weeks unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and putting my own touch on the place. I built a small raised garden in the backyard for tomatoes and peppers. I set up a hammock between two old oak trees. My weekends were filled with trips to the local hardware store, not because I had to do anything urgently, but because I actually enjoyed making the house mine. There was a sense of ownership here that I had never experienced in the city. It wasn't long before I met a few neighbors, mostly friendly, polite people who waved when they drove by and chatted if they saw me working outside. I met Mr. Jensen, who lived across the street and had been there for 20 years. He was retired and spent most of his days tinkering in his garage. He told me the neighborhood used to have a formal HOA years ago, but it had fizzled out after some internal disagreements. That piece of information gave me a sense of relief. If an HOA had once existed but was gone, it meant no one would try to bring it back. Right, I was wrong. It was a Saturday afternoon about 6 months after I moved in when I first met Karen. I had just come back from mowing the lawn, sweaty and ready for a cold drink, when I saw a woman walking up my driveway. She was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp pink blouse tucked into white slacks. She carried a clipboard and wore a name badge that read, Karen Dawson, HOA President. Afternoon, she said briskly, without a smile. I'm here about a few issues with your property. I blinked, caught off guard. Sorry, who exactly are you? She lifted the clipboard slightly, as if it explained everything. I'm the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. You've been here long enough to know our rules, and unfortunately, you're already in violation of several. I shook my head, confused. There's no HOA here. My deed doesn't mention one, and when I bought this house, the agent told me there wasn't one. Karen gave me a tight smile, the kind people give when they think you're being deliberately difficult. Everyone on this street is part of my HOA, whether they like it or not. It's for the good of the neighborhood. We keep things looking nice, keep property values high. We've been operating for years. The way she said my HOA stuck out to me. Not the HOA, not our HOA, my HOA. Like it was her personal kingdom and we were all her subjects. Well, I said carefully, I'm not part of it. I never signed anything and I'm not paying dues to a group I didn't agree to join. Her smile vanished. She pulled a piece of paper from her clipboard and handed it to me. This is a notice for your fence. It's too tall. We have a maximum height of 4 feet for front yard fences, and yours is clearly over that. You'll need to replace it within 30 days or face fines. I stared at the paper, then back at her. You can't fine me. You don't have any authority over my property. Karen let out a sharp little laugh. We'll see about that. I suggest you read the bylaws and don't ignore this. Non-compliance gets expensive quickly. She turned on her heel and walked back down my driveway without another word. That was my first taste of how Karen operated, confident, pushy, and absolutely certain she was in the right. At first I assumed this was just some misunderstanding. Maybe she thought the old HOA rules still applied. Maybe she'd gotten used to neighbors going along with her and didn't realize she had no legal leg to stand on. I figured ignoring her would be the easiest path forward. But Karen didn't take being ignored lightly. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the Willow Creek HOA, complete with a fake-looking logo at the top. It listed 3 violations: my fence height, excessive weeds in my flower beds, I had maybe 2 dandelions, and my driveway being non-compliant with community standards because it was wider than most. The letter ended with, total, fines due $450. I crumpled it up and tossed it straight in the trash. Over the next month, the letters kept coming. One claimed I needed to paint my front door a neutral color. Another said my truck was not an approved vehicle for a driveway. Parking. Then came the threats. Failure to pay fines will result in legal action. One evening, I was outside watering my garden when Mr. Jensen wandered over. You've met Karen, I see, he said with a smirk. Met her. She's been harassing me for weeks, I replied. He nodded knowingly. She's been running this pretend HOA for a while now. A few folks around here just pay her to avoid the hassle. Others ignore her. She likes to target new people, thinks she can scare them into following her rules. Is she even legit? I asked. He laughed outright. Not even close. She never filed anything with the county. The original HOA dissolved over a decade ago, but she acts like it still exists. Some people go along with it because they don't want the drama. That little piece of information planted a seed in my mind. If she wasn't legally running an HOA, then she had no power to fine me, no power to enforce any rules, and certainly no right to demand money. But Karen wasn't done escalating. A few days later, I got a knock at the door. When I opened it, Karen was standing there again, this time with a man holding a camera. "We're documenting violations for our records," she announced. "Your records?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She ignored the question and started listing things off, like she was some kind of property inspector. Overgrown hedge on the east side. Driveway still non-compliant, unauthorized vehicle in driveway. "You've been warned multiple times." I stepped forward, blocking the man's view. "I told you before, I'm not in your HOA. You have no right to be here, and if you step onto my property again without permission, I'll call the police." Karen's lips tightened. "You'll regret this. We're taking you to court." I almost laughed in her face, but instead I shut the door. Truth be told, I didn't think she'd actually follow through. But a week later, a certified letter arrived. Karen Dawson, as president of the Willow Creek HOA, was suing me in small claims court for unpaid dues, fines, and damage to community appearance. The total $3,200. That night, I called an old friend from college who worked as a lawyer. I read him the complaint and told him the background. He was quiet for a moment before saying, "She's bluffing. I'll bet you anything her HOA isn't even registered." Within 2 days, he had the proof. No active HOA was on file for our subdivision. No corporate registration, nothing. What Karen was doing wasn't just pushy, it was legally meaningless. I leaned back in my chair after hearing the news, a slow grin spreading across my face. For the first time since Karen had knocked on my door, I felt like I was in control. She had no idea that she had just made the biggest mistake of her little reign. The court summons gave me a date that was only 3 weeks away, which meant I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. But the truth was, I wasn't nervous at all. Knowing now that Karen's so-called HOA didn't exist in any legal capacity was like walking into a poker game knowing your opponent's cards. The real challenge would be keeping a straight face until the right moment came to reveal it. My lawyer friend, Mike, agreed to help me out for free, mostly because he found the whole thing hilarious. "You've got to understand something," he told me over coffee one morning. "Judges see cases like this sometimes where someone claims authority they don't have. They don't like it. In fact, they tend to shut it down fast. But we need to bring everything: copies of your deed, county property records, and proof that there's no HOA registered here. The cleaner our evidence, the more satisfying the takedown will be." I followed his instructions to the letter. I went down to the county clerk's office myself, got certified copies of the dissolution papers for the original Willow Creek HOA from over a decade ago, and even got a statement from the clerk confirming that no such organization had been registered since. I also printed out all the letters Karen had sent me, every ridiculous demand about lawn heights and mailbox styles. Seeing them all together, stacked an inch thick, was almost comical. In the days leading up to court, I noticed something strange. Karen seemed even more confident than before. She walked around the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her kingdom. One morning, I saw her talking to 2 other neighbors at the end of the street, binder in hand, clearly trying to rally them as witnesses. I even overheard her say, "Once I win this, people will finally take my authority seriously again." It was becoming clear to me that this wasn't just about me, this was about Karen's ego. She needed this case to cement her image as the neighborhood's ruler. The night before the hearing, I barely slept, not because of nerves, but because I kept running the scene in my head. I imagined her walking into the courtroom, binder clutched tight, speaking with all the confidence in the world, only for the judge to look over her so-called evidence and drop the hammer. That thought kept me grinning in the dark. On the morning of the court date, I arrived early. The small claims courtroom was simple. Just a few rows of benches, a raised desk for the judge, and 2 tables for the parties involved. I set my folder of documents neatly on the table and sat down. Karen arrived about 10 minutes later. She was dressed like she was going to a corporate board meeting: bright red blazer, high heels, hair perfectly sprayed into place. She glanced at me, smirked, and took the opposite table. When the judge entered, a calm-looking older man with glasses, everyone stood. After he took his seat, he went through the formalities and then said, "Case of Willow Creek Homeowners Association versus..." He looked down at the paper. "Mr. Thompson." Karen jumped up immediately. "Your Honor, I am the president of the Willow Creek HOA, and I am here today because the defendant has repeatedly violated our community bylaws, refused to pay required dues, and ignored numerous warnings. We are seeking compensation in the amount of $3,200 to cover unpaid fees and damages to the neighborhood's appearance." The judge raised an eyebrow. "All right, and what evidence do you have to support these claims?" Karen practically sprinted to hand him her binder. "Here, Your Honor, detailed records of every violation, photos of his property, copies of the notices we sent, and the bylaws we operate under. The judge began flipping through the binder slowly. I watched his expression carefully. He didn't look convinced. After a moment, he looked up at her. "Mrs. Dawson, where is the official documentation showing that your HOA is registered and recognized as a legal entity?" Karen didn't miss a beat. "We've been operating for years. Your Honor, everyone in the neighborhood knows we have an HOA. It's been the same set of rules since before most people moved in." "That's not what I asked," the judge said, his tone sharper now. "I'm asking for the official registration paperwork, articles of incorporation, county filings, something showing legal authority to enforce these bylaws." For the first time, Karen hesitated. "Well, the original HOA was formed years, but do you have proof that it currently exists as a legal entity?" The judge interrupted. She straightened her shoulders. "We didn't think it was necessary to refile. We've been operating under the same guidelines all along." That was my cue. "Your Honor," I said, standing up, "I have certified documents from the county clerk showing that the original Willow Creek HOA was dissolved over 10 years ago. I also have a certified statement confirming that no such organization has been registered since then." I walked forward and handed him the folder. Judge opened it, scanned the first page, and his eyebrows rose. "This is from the county clerk." "Yes, Your Honor, and in addition, I have my property deed, which contains no mention of an HOA, no covenants, no agreements binding me to any such rules. I never joined, never signed anything, and never agreed to pay any dues." The judge took a deep breath and set the folder down. He looked directly at Karen. "Mrs. Dawson, without legal registration, you do not have an HOA. What you have is an informal group of neighbors, which has no authority to impose fines, collect dues, or enforce rules on unwilling participants." Karen's face went pale. But people have been paying dues for years." "That," the judge said firmly, "is between them and you, but it has no legal standing in this courtroom. This case is dismissed." I thought that was it. But then the judge leaned back and continued. "Furthermore, I am issuing an order that you cease representing yourself as the president of a legal homeowners association. You may not send notices, fines, or threats to any neighbor under the claim of HOA authority. Do you understand?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. The judge tapped his gavel. Once case closed. It was over in less than 15 minutes. I gathered my papers and walked out of the courtroom feeling like I'd just won the championship round of a boxing match. Behind me, I could hear Karen's heels clicking quickly as she stormed out, muttering something under her breath. I didn't turn around. In the parking lot, Mike was waiting by his car with a grin. "That," he said, "was one of the easiest wins I've ever seen. She didn't even bother to check her own legal status before dragging you in here." I laughed. "She thought her authority was real because no one had challenged her before. Now she knows better than that," Mike said. "Now the whole neighborhood will know." He was right. By the time I got home, word was already spreading. Mr. Jensen was out by his mailbox and called over to me. "Heard you took down the Queen." I couldn't help but laugh. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cold drink watching the sun set. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt completely at ease in my own home. Karen's reign was over, at least for me and, judging by the judge's order, for everyone else too. Of course, I didn't think she'd go quietly. People like Karen rarely do. But whatever her next move would be, I was ready. After all, I'd just taken away the crown she thought she wore. The day after the court hearing, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow. For months, there had been this quiet, invisible tension hanging in the air, a sense that everyone was tiptoeing around Karen to avoid becoming her next target. Now, after the judge's ruling, that grip seemed to loosen. I could feel it the moment I stepped outside the next morning. Mr. Jensen gave me a thumbs up from across the street. The elderly couple 2 houses down, the Parkers, waved enthusiastically as they got their morning paper. Even people I hadn't spoken to before were smiling at me like I'd just done them a personal favor. It didn't take long to realize why Karen's little HOA club had affected more people than I thought. That afternoon, I ran into Sarah, a young mom who lived 3 houses over. She was pushing a stroller and slowed down when she saw me. "You're the guy who took her to court, right?" she asked quietly, almost as if she didn't want to say Karen's name out loud. "She took me to court," I corrected with a small grin. "But yeah, that was me." Sarah let out a relieved laugh. "You now have no idea how much you've helped. She's been harassing us for years, telling us where we could put our trash cans, what color our shutters had to be. We've paid her hundreds in so-called fines just to get her to leave us alone." I raised an eyebrow. Why didn't anyone challenge her before? She glanced around like she was checking for eavesdroppers because most of us didn't know we could. She made it sound official, said if we didn't follow the rules, she'd put liens on our houses. We thought she had that power. That conversation stuck with me. Karen's so-called HOA had been nothing more than a confidence trick, and she'd been playing it for years. The thought of how much money she'd taken from these people made my stomach turn. By the end of the week, I started hearing more and more stories. An older man named Bill told me she'd made him replace his shed because it wasn't aesthetic. Another neighbor said she'd been told to cut down a perfectly healthy tree because it blocked the sightline of the street. Karen's control had been all about intimidation and appearance, never legality. It became clear that while the judge's order had stripped away her official-sounding title, Karen herself wasn't ready to let go. She didn't have that in her nature. On Friday evening, I was sitting on my porch when I noticed her walking door to door. She wasn't carrying her usual clipboard this time, but she had a manila envelope in her hand and was speaking to each neighbor at length. She skipped my house entirely, which told me two things. She knew I wouldn't play along, and she was looking for allies later. I found out from Mr. Jensen that she was trying to form a neighborhood improvement committee, which was just a thinly disguised attempt to bring back her HOA in a different form. She's telling people it's voluntary, Jensen said with a smirk, but the second you join, she'll treat it like a government contract. Some neighbors were buying it. I could see why Karen had a certain persuasive charm when she wasn't barking orders. She could make her pitch sound like she was just trying to make things nice for everyone. But others were now openly resisting. I even overheard two women talking outside the corner store about how they planned to demand refunds for all the fines they'd paid her over the years. The cracks in Karen's influence were widening. One afternoon I got a knock on the door. It was Tom, a middle-aged guy from the other end of the street. I'd seen him around but never really spoken to him. He looked angry. "You're the guy who beat Karen in court, right?" he asked without introduction. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Stepped closer. You need to know something. She's been telling people you lied in court. She's saying your documents were fake and that the judge was biased against her. She's trying to convince everyone she still has power." I sighed. "That doesn't surprise me." Tom shook his head. "I think she's gearing up for something. She asked me if I'd be willing to testify for her if she took you back to court. I told her no, but she's asking a lot of people." That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just trying to save face, she was plotting a comeback a few days later. The tension that had seemed to dissolve after court started to creep back. Neighbors began whispering again. I saw Karen having hushed conversations on porches, always keeping an eye out to make sure I wasn't within earshot. It was like she was campaigning, but for what, I didn't know yet. One evening, Sarah came by again, looking uneasy. "She's holding a meeting at her house next week," she said. "She's calling it a community vision night, but I think it's more than that. You should come." "Why would she let me in?" I asked. Sarah smirked. "She won't, but I'm inviting you as my guest. She can't exactly kick out a mom with a baby without looking bad in front of everyone." I agreed instantly. The following Thursday, I walked into Karen's living room with Sarah. About a dozen neighbors were there, sitting in folding chairs arranged in neat rows. At the front, Karen stood next to a whiteboard with the words "Rebuilding Our Neighborhood" written in bold letters. She was smiling, but when her eyes landed on me, that smile tightened. She started her speech with talk about bringing back standards and making the neighborhood a place we can all be proud of. It was classic Karen, vague enough to sound positive, but pointed enough that everyone knew she meant control. Then she started passing out forms, calling them interest sheets for the new committee. I scanned one from over Sarah's shoulder. It was basically a contract commitment to follow guidelines, pay dues, and accept enforcement measures. It was the HOA all over again, just with a different name. When she got to me, she hesitated. "You're not exactly welcome here," she said flatly. I smiled politely. "Just observing, to make sure everything's legal this time." A couple of neighbors chuckled. Karen's jaw tightened, but she moved on. After the meeting, I stood outside talking with a small group who hadn't signed a form. One man said, "I'm done letting her tell me what to do. If she tries to push this through, I'm going to the police." Another woman added, "I'm asking for my money back from all those fines. If she refuses, I'm taking her to small claims." It was becoming clear while Karen was trying to rebuild her power, she was also creating more enemies than she could handle. Over the next week, I started hearing about neighbors banding together not to form a new committee, but to stop Karen. Some were pooling money to hire a lawyer. Others were gathering all the letters and fines she'd sent over the years as evidence in case things got ugly. For me, it was personal now. Not because I hated Karen, but because I hated bullies. And that's exactly what she was, a bully with a clipboard and a title she made up for herself. I didn't know what her next move would be, but I had a feeling the real battle wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. The following week, the quiet tension in the neighborhood started tightening again, like a rope slowly being pulled taut. It wasn't just the usual gossip anymore. Something was brewing. You could feel it in the way people spoke in hushed tones, at the mailbox, in the sidelong glances when Karen drove by in her spotless white SUV. Word was spreading that she had a big announcement coming, and this time she was claiming it would change the neighborhood forever. By now, I knew better than to underestimate her persistence. Losing in court had been a huge blow to her pride, but Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. She'd been working the back channels, talking to anyone willing to listen, spinning the story that she'd been wronged by a biased judge and a troublemaker neighbor. On Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Jensen waved me over as I was pulling weeds from the garden. He was leaning on his mailbox, the ever-present cup of coffee in his hand. "You hear about Friday night?" he asked. I shook my head. She's holding another meeting, this time at the community park under the pavilion. Says it's open to all residents and that she's unveiling her neighborhood restoration plan. I groaned. Sounds like a sequel no one asked for. She's telling people she's going to form a special maintenance district or something like that, Jensen continued. Claims she's been talking to the county about it. If she pulls that off, it's like an HOA with actual teeth. You need to be there. That last part stuck in my head for the rest of the day. If Karen really was talking to the county, then she wasn't just trying to play queen anymore, she was aiming to make her power legitimate. Friday came faster than I wanted it to. The park pavilion was already half full when I arrived, with rows of folding chairs set up facing a portable podium Karen had brought in. A large banner hung behind her that read, Willow Creek, taking back our neighborhood. Karen was in full campaign mode, bright blue blazer, pearl earrings, hair flawless as ever. She smiled like a politician as she shook hands and greeted people. The moment her eyes landed on me, that smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place. I sat near the back, next to Sarah and Tom. Tom leaned over and muttered, "She's been telling people this is their chance to fix all the problems in the neighborhood." Translation: give her control again. When the meeting started, Karen launched into a speech about declining property values, lack of unity, and the need for strong leadership. Her voice carried easily under the pavilion roof, and I noticed she had a small stack of papers on the podium. This, she announced dramatically, holding one up, is our petition to form a special maintenance district with county approval. If we get enough signatures, we can bring back standards, enforce rules, and ensure our neighborhood stays beautiful for years to come. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded approvingly, others exchanged wary glances. Karen smiled wider. And of course, I would be honored to serve as the head of the committee overseeing this effort. I raised my hand. Question. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she forced a polite tone. Yes, would this district be mandatory for everyone in the neighborhood? I asked. Once approved, yes, she said confidently. But that's the point, everyone benefits equally. I stood up. So what you're saying is, this is just another HOA, only this time you want the county to give you the legal power you didn't have before. Her smile thinned. This is nothing like the old HOA. This is about community improvement. No, I said firmly, my voice carrying across the pavilion. This is about you trying to get back the control. You lost when the judge shut down your fake HOA, and if anyone here is considering signing that petition, they should know exactly who they're handing power to and how she's abused it in the past. The murmur grew louder. Karen's jaw tightened, but she tried to laugh it off. Oh, here we go again, Mr. Thompson, the neighborhood conspiracy theorist conspiracy, I said, pulling a thick folder from my bag. These are copies of the court documents from our case. They prove her HOA was never legal. They prove she had no authority to fine anyone, and yet she took thousands of dollars from people under false pretenses. If she gets this petition approved, she'll have real power to do it again legally this time. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Sarah stood up beside me. He's telling the truth. She'll fine me $200 for having a pink tricycle in my yard. Said it clashed with the aesthetic. Another neighbor chimed in from the other side of the pavilion. She made me replace my mailbox twice. Karen's composure was cracking. These are isolated incidents, she snapped. And for the record, many of you appreciated my efforts to keep this neighborhood looking respectable. That's because you made people believe they had no choice, Tom called out. You scared them into paying you. Now the crowd was split, half glaring at Karen, half looking confused, unsure who to believe. She tried to rally. If we don't act now, property values will drop, crime will rise, and this neighborhood will fall apart. Do you want that? No, I said, stepping forward. But I also don't want to live under the thumb of someone who's proven they'll abuse their power. If she really cared about this neighborhood, she'd find a way to help without demanding control and money from everyone. The tension was so thick you could feel it. Finally, an older man in the front row stood up. I think we've heard enough. I'm not signing anything. He walked out. One by one, others followed. Some stayed behind. But the energy had shifted. The big announcement had backfired. Karen's face was flushed as she gathered her papers. Fine, she said sharply. If you want this place to turn into a dump, that's on you. She shoved the petition into her bag and stormed off. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah turned to me. That might have been the nail in her coffin. Maybe, I said, watching Karen's SUV peel out of the parking lot. But I've got a feeling she's not done yet. The truth was, I didn't believe for a second that Karen would walk away quietly. People like her didn't just give up, they waited, they schemed, and they came back swinging. But if she was planning another round, she'd have to know by now that the neighborhood wasn't as easy to push around anymore. The days following Karen's failed neighborhood restoration plan were strangely quiet. No flyers appeared on doors, no passive-aggressive emails showed up in inboxes, and Karen's white SUV was noticeably absent from its usual patrols through Willow Creek. At first, some of us thought maybe she'd finally gotten the message, But deep down, I knew her silence wasn't surrender. Karen was the kind of person who believed losing was temporary, that all setbacks could be overturned if she simply tried harder or played dirtier. And sure enough, the calm broke the following Wednesday. I was sipping my morning coffee on the porch when I heard the sound of hammering down the street. Looking over, I saw Karen's nephew, a wiry 20-something in a backwards cap, nailing a huge wooden sign into the ground near the park entrance. From my angle, I could just make out the bold letters, Community Standards Initiative. Soon, by the time I got there, a small group of neighbors had gathered, staring at the sign with confusion. Karen herself stood nearby, clipboard in hand, speaking in her most cheerful voice. No, this isn't like last time, she was telling Mrs. Carter, the sweet older woman who lived 2 houses from me. This is voluntary. Entirely voluntary. We're just asking people to pledge to follow the standards and contribute a small monthly fee to keep things nice. I noticed she was careful with her words, framing it as something harmless, even neighborly. But I also noticed the small print at the bottom of the sign. Non-compliance may result in review by the Neighborhood Oversight Committee. It was a loophole, a sneaky one. By getting people to sign a pledge, she could argue later that they'd agreed to give her authority. It wouldn't be legally binding for everyone, but it would be enough for her to target the ones who'd signed, possibly convincing others to join through pressure and guilt. I stepped forward. Karen, we've been through this. You don't have the authority to enforce anything here. The court made that clear. She turned to me, her smile thinning. This isn't about enforcement. This is about pride in our community. If people want to live in a clean, orderly neighborhood, they should be willing to commit to it. Commit to you mean? I shot back. The crowd murmured. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Karen was trying to bait me into looking like the villain again, but this time, I had a plan. That afternoon, I printed fresh copies of the court ruling, along with a 1-page summary in plain language explaining exactly why Karen's old HOA had been illegal. I added a paragraph warning people about voluntary pledges, how they could be twisted into giving someone authority they didn't actually have. By sunset, I'd gone door to door with Sarah and Tom, handing them out to every house in the neighborhood. Most people were grateful. Some were shocked to learn just how much Karen had fabricated in the past, and a few, those still under her spell, insisted she was just trying to help. 2 days later, the big confrontation came. Karen had set up a folding table near the sign, covered with stacks of pledge forms, cookies, and bottled water. She called it her community unity station. As people passed by, she'd wave them over and try to charm them into signing. When I walked up with Sarah and Tom, she didn't look pleased. Here to cause trouble again, I see, she said. Flatly, just here to make sure people know the facts, I replied, holding up the court documents. Karen scoffed. You think anyone cares about your papers? They care about their property values, their safety, their quality of life. You're standing in the way of all that. No, I said, raising my voice so the small crowd nearby could hear. I'm standing in the way of you getting the same control you abused before. And I think people here deserve to know how far you're willing to go to get it. Then I told them everything. I recounted the fake violation notices, the bogus fines, the way she had intimidated people into replacing things that didn't need replacing. I explained how she'd tried to get the county to create a special maintenance district so she could run a legalized HOA. I even told them about her latest scheme with the voluntary pledges and how those could easily be twisted, where face went from red to pale to red again. She tried to interject, but the neighbors began chiming in with their own experiences, things I didn't even know about. Someone said she'd demanded they move their garden because it wasn't visible enough from the street. Another said she'd threatened to call animal control over a dog that wasn't even theirs. The more they spoke, the more the tide turned. People started tearing up pledge forms right in front of her. A few even walked away from the table without saying a word. Finally, Mr. Jensen stepped forward. Karen, we're done with this. We've given you chance after chance, and every time, you've made it about control, not community. This neighborhood doesn't need you to fix it. We're fine without your oversight. Karen stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually admit defeat, but instead, she muttered something about ungrateful people and began packing up her things. That was the last time we saw her pushing any sort of organized effort in Willow Creek. She still lived here, of course, and we still saw her SUV drive by now and then, but the signs, the petitions, the meetings, they all stopped. She kept to herself more, and so did the few who had been her most loyal supporters. Life slowly returned to normal. Kids played in front yards without parents, worrying about aesthetic violations. People painted their mailboxes however they liked. Neighbors chatted without the undercurrent of fear that someone might report them for leaving a trash can out too long. One evening, months later, Sarah and I were walking through the park when she said, "It feels lighter now, doesn't it?" I nodded, like the air's finally cleared. Karen's shadow had been a heavy one, but we'd learned something important through the whole ordeal, that a neighborhood's strength didn't come from rules and fines, but from people looking out for each other, and in the end, that was something she could never control. Call to action. If you enjoyed this story, Make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality for more real-life drama and neighborhood tales that keep you hooked. Your support helps us bring you the best stories straight from Bright Reality to your screen.